In the name of the one and only, we are starting another session of the Indigo Firmament. And as the name of the program indicates, we are looking into the Indigo Firmament for answers that we may or may not find. One thing is for certain, that in the indigo firmament, in the blue sky above, or that which we identify as sky for convenience, the only certainty is its infinite expansiveness. And we, with our limited senses, are trying to measure the immeasurable. In the previous program, we discussed the God phenomenon. What is God and how it has been understood historically, regardless of whether that may be perceived as scientific, historical, mythical, superstitious, in any ways. I'll give you a summary of the discussion we had, which was based on the argument of the God-human relationship, or the connection between the sacred and the profane. And it is in this equation that we explored the first part, the God and the sacred. And we hope to discuss in today's program the other half, the profane and the human. Not that they are necessarily one and the same. We talked about how our exploratory, expansive, extending, expressive terminologies in the language indicated that we must be seeking these outside of ourselves. We have to go out to explore. That the whole emphasis is on an understanding, and if there is a potential and possibility for an understanding, that has to be sought from without. And then we talked about how our perceptions are formed by the family structure and values, and the social environment, and then we keep going outwards into nation states and other units and entities that we may call terrestrial, and then we go beyond to the celestial. And in each one we expand our perceptions of the divine, and as it becomes greater and greater, and we realize that we get to a point that there's no way we can measure that. And this was all discussed in the context of humanity's obsession with the God phenomenon. And as we move outwards of our isolationism into a connectedness that may or may not be reachable to the object of our desire, in this case the spiritual, in this case the divine. We discussed how in the early myths we had an obsession with the unknown, and the unknown being symbolically signified by the darkness, that in the beginning there was darkness, and it's from the darkness that we come to light. We also discuss how the universe is primarily defined by a totality of darkness, or rather a darkness in which there are sparkles of, for lack of a better term, solar systems here and there, that reveals some of the innumerable and countless realities hidden in the darkness of the universe, and how humans have understood this, not necessarily in the rational sense, the details of an observable, but rather through the psycho-spiritual as to how we could reach out and look for light in the darkness. We also went to some of our myths where the darkness, the night, the Lail, the Lilith, the Laili, in the religious, in the scriptural, in the literary, in the poetic, in the romantic sense, in a way defines our yearning for the unknown in that darkness. And therefore all of these were meant to explore again through that outward looking realm of reality for a God that is variously defined and described, that is understood as a matter of reason, rationality, as well as religion and conviction, that is understood both as a matter of faith and belief system, but also a scientific undeniability of the fact that all reality that has formed into systems, harmonious systems, congruent, connected, separated, scattered, and in every other possible form. But the commonality, the language that speaks to us from all of that, is the language of harmony, order. That the order implies that there has to be a creator, a manager, a power, a field of energy that is putting things, so to say, into an order. In other words, the recognition of the concept of order denies and rejects any concept of an accidental occurrence and coming into existence of life. That if life, whether it's human, biological, botanical, or in any other form, if it could come into existence as a matter of accident or incident or an occurring, that could not have happened unless there was a power beyond it. And the power beyond it can be described both at two levels. One, that even if we assume that certain chemical reactions and interactions defined the formation of life, even if we understand that, say, at the level of minerals and particles and organic matter, there was an interaction, the very nature of chemical elements interacting in a certain precise way. That very perception speaks of a harmony of sorts. that if chemical elements interact in a predictable way, this predictability in itself is a harmony. And say if the seemingly dead celestial bodies with no living matter on them are still oscillating, rotating, circumambulating each other, there has to be a harmony. By simply identifying it as a force of gravity, we cannot deny that there is order. Even the force of gravity, even the law of gravity, even the relational aspect of gravity, all imply a harmony of sorts. And all of these harmonies are orders. And orders imply they are not accidental. And if they are not accidental, then that which makes them tick the way they do is the power we ought to recognize. Whether we apply the concept of sacredness to them, to that entity, or not, it's the undeniability of it. And so this was in essence the discussion we had then, and we are going to bridge that with further exploration of it now in today's program. That as far as God was concerned, we either accepted it or understood it as both an essential God and a perceptive God, with the understanding that the term God may have become obsolete in its historical context. That is, that the God of the primitive human beings may have been way too primitive, in the sense that it was perceived in an environment, in a setting, and the things that were attributed to it, the powers attributed to that God of the earlier millennia of the human thought, were basically in response to natural phenomena. But as we progressively grew out of that, and I'm talking about humanity, as we progressively moved out of that and realized that the God we had perceived was not sufficient for an understanding of a God that we need to find in our own time. And so God has been understood progressively better, but that does not imply that we understand God as a phenomenon. We do have an understanding of it, a perception of it. And so that's where the distinction between the essential God, that of a necessity there ought to be a God responsible or in charge of all the harmonious orders that I listed earlier. Now, that is the essential God, acknowledging the existence of one. Whereas the perceptive God is how we perceive it in our own mindset with our limited understanding. Most religions have, in the past, most religious traditions have dealt with the perceptive God, whereas the sciences and philosophy have discussed an essential God. This dual approach, but separate approach, has been a problem throughout history, at least the European history, where the philosophers talked about the essential God, and the believers and people of religion generally talked about the perceptive God. And because gods were not defined as such, the mere mention of the terminology in their minds assumed that they were talking about one God, whereas in reality they were not. That in reality the philosopher was talking about an essential God, and the theologian was talking about a perceptive God. No wonder they could not reach an understanding, either for the sake of their own argumentation or for the sake of how we, the rest of humanity, could have benefited from them. And that dragged on, that debate, that argument, that oppositional attitude, dragged on for centuries without reaching any sort of understanding that they were talking about two different gods and defined in different ways. The attempt in this program that I am pursuing is in line with the Islamic thinking, in Islamic mysticism, in Sufism. And in Sufism, there is a belief both in a transcendent God as well as an intimate God. So the transcendent God would be the God that would be close to the God that we often think of as the essential God, the God of the philosopher. The God that is that cannot be understood, the God that is the unknowable known, as the Sufis would say. So we'll put these two expressions side by side. The dichotomy I explained in the previous program, which is one of the perceptive versus the essential, along the line of the transcendent versus the immanent. Now, the difference here is critical. In the essential, in understanding the essential God, we are talking about a necessity that emanates from an understanding of a cosmic reality that is all harmony and order. Now, we see the consequence, which is the order, which is these countless harmonious systems within the universe. That is the consequence. Now, we do not see, say, their maker, their manager, the person responsible for it, the force, the field of energy, in any way you describe it, whatever has caused it. So the cause of the causes, in that sense, is not understood. but the consequence of the consequence is understood. And that in itself is a mystery, but that is how we would look at the essential God. The perceptive is that after an observation, if not by other beings that we cannot claim, at least by the human beings, the perception is how that reality is observed, ingested, internalized, and how is it reflected upon, using as much the power of the reason, but more than that, using the power of the human imagination. And we should mention that the human imagination, the active imagination, ought to be seen differently than what imagination is often associated with as fantasy. The active imagination is an essential part of our understanding. In other words, our thinking and our imagining go hand in hand in understanding a phenomenon. And perhaps we should talk about that aspect of the imagination as an internal sense in another segment of the Indigo Firmament. But for today, it is important to understand that the perceptive God has to be understood as much by reason as it is by imagination. The creative imagination, the active imagination. I would emphasize on the active rather than the creative. The creative might be leaning more towards the fantasy, whereas the active imagination is more the projected one for understanding the phenomena. So that would be, that's how we would define the essential God versus the perceptive. Now we will go to the transcendent God versus the immanent. Now, the transcendent God, as I said, correspond closely to the essential God. That is the God that is beyond the realm of our perception. That is the God that is the unknowable known. The known part being that it is acknowledged. The unknowable is that it cannot be understood. You put the two together, therefore, the transcendent God is acknowledged because it cannot be denied, but it is not knowable because we are not equipped. We are not equipped in terms of our sense power, in terms of our sense perception, to detect it, to measure it, to see it. However, we do see the effect of it. So that's the transcendent God. And the fourth God is the immanent God. For Islamic thought in general, but for Islamic mysticism or Sufism in particular, the immanent God is, I felt like saying essential, but I mean it essential in the terms of necessary, not necessarily essential in terms of its essence and being. The two are similar, but the emphasis is on the necessary part of it. That God is immanent, and immanent also is to be understood as close. And close means close to our selves. And the self here is not defined in the body form. And therefore, as you bring your perceptions closer from a far distance, it gets so close that it is not the line of your sight that defines the point zero, but that there is a within of a within you. In other words, there is an inner core of you in which you would find the immanent God. So, as I said, in the earlier traditions, the philosophers will take one road and the theologians another. Now, what Sufism does is that it puts the two together. It gets rid of that dichotomy. It gets rid of that debate that God ought to be understood either through reason and rational power, or alternatively through conviction and emotional perception. But that these faculties of understanding in the human need not to be used one at the expense of the other, but that they ought to be used together. So, the God of the Sufi is at the same time transcendent, that is, it is a greatness of a cosmic totality that includes everything there is in the cosmic reality. That there is, regardless of whether we can measure it and see it or not, but in principle, however far these universes expand, and they may expand into an endless, at least in terms of human imagination, into an endless realm of perpetual existences, of multiverses. That is a mouthful. But more than that, it is mind-boggling to just define it, let alone to sit back, close your eyes, and imagine it, because we do not have any other power other than the human imagination to sense the vastness of cosmic reality. And since the belief is that God is in everything, and if we can define cosmic reality, every place and every time within it, that is, the dimensionality of all existence within the cosmic reality is to be, or is, filled with the divine essence. Therefore, there is no placeness that does not contain God. There's no timeness that does not contain God. And so, therefore, God fills every form of reality regardless of any dimensional description of it. That is the transcendent God. Transcendence in this case means it transcends, it goes beyond the realm of the human perception. The beyond. Now, if God is there, and if God is everywhere, then where do we, human beings, individuals, stand in relationship to it? Logically, it would appear that if God is the totality of all existence, then the minuscule existence that we as individual beings have is basically irrelevant. We are irrelevant to the point of nothingness in the totality of that cosmic reality. And yet, in this nothingness that is us in relationship to the totality, we cannot deny that there is a God within us. We may not amount to much, quantitatively speaking, in relation to all living matters, but at least from our individual self-perception, ego-centered or self-centered, or both, we cannot deny to ourselves the selfness of our own being. We do exist. And once you move that concentration from the totality of, say, a God-centered multiverses to a human-centered individuality, and you still feel there is room for a divine power, for a connectedness with the divine within, then we operate with an immanent God. That is the God that is so close to our hearts, that the relationship we have with that God, the closeness and the intimacy, and again from a Sufi perspective, that intimacy is nothing but what the Sufis called the divine beloved. In other words, here, the force that connects the sacred and the profane, the forces that connect the human and the divine, is not the force of gravity. It's not the force of rational thinking. It's not essentiality, but is the pull. It's the drawing of an inner power that cannot be defined in any other term except love. And yes, in the Sufi mythology, God created us out of love. God loved to create, and therefore our very raison d'être, our very reason for being, is love and not necessity. And so then comes the question as to where do these two gods meet, the immanent and the transcendent. And again, from a Sophionic perception, they are not two different gods. Its transcendent nature is not exclusive of its immanent nature, and vice versa. And for us humans, it is necessary to see God in both of those ways. And that way, we can relate to God as the divine beloved without denying God, its nature as the totality, the cosmic totality. And so this discussion will then take us to the next step, which is, if the God phenomenon as we understood it is such as what we talked about, then what falls on the other side of this equation, the equation of the God-human relationship? The question arises as to who are we? If we concentrate all on God, and we did, and we have some understanding, it is only a matter of argument that we have to explore the other half of that equation of God-human relationship. Who are we as humans? So we will devote the rest of this discussion to this concept of the human phenomenon. But I must emphasize that the important element in the human-God relationship, more important than God as an entity and more important as human, more important than human as an entity, is the relationship between the human and the God. It's this relationship that matters more than the separated identification of the two sides. So the emphasis would be that that the seeking and the sought. The sought was discussed, God. The seeking has not been discussed, that's the human. But what is this draw? What is this pull? What is this connection? What is this magnifying or magnetic force, rather, that is drawing the two together? We easily refer to God as the unknowable known. The assumption being that then we ourselves are the knowable known. But let me question that. Do we know ourselves enough to identify ourselves as the knowable? I'm thinking that there is a problem there, in that in reality we do not know ourselves as much as we ought to. And you might find this kind of unreasonable and perhaps even ridiculous, but let's go a bit further. If we are talking about ourselves, we humans, how do we define ourselves? We are biological frames, skeletons, coated with flesh and skin, and we have senses, and there are systems working within ourselves, and we walk around and about, and we identify ourselves by names or nouns or pronouns, colors, creeds, religions, all sorts of identities, he, she, it, etc. But is that what we really amount to? Is that really the essence of our being? Are we simply biological living things walking around? And if so, then perhaps we could say that we are no different than other living beings, cats, dogs, birds, and millions of other living beings are, at least on the planet Earth, if not beyond. And if we reduce ourselves only to our biological being, then we have denied ourselves the other dimensions of ourselves. And the other dimensions would be, what about human as an intellectual being? What about human as an intuitive wholeness? What about humans as a psycho-spiritual being? What about humans as mythical beings? Not just mystical, but mythical. And so, if we explore those possibilities sufficiently, we realize that, as I've always said, that we humans are too sophisticated even to be understood by ourselves. And with that one statement, then we can say we don't know who we are. We have some ideas as to who we are, but we do not know the totality of ourselves either. Take our understanding of ourselves biologically. Again, if we go to the early sciences or the measures of knowing living phenomenon, we would look at ourselves either as organic matter, chemical elements that have come together, or biological, and perhaps physical then. But is that all what we really amount to? One of the most respected sciences that we have now and have had for most of the human history is the science of medicine. But what is the preoccupation of medical science, especially in more recent times? That it treats us strictly as, say, chemical biological beings. That the other dimensions of our identities that I refer to are totally ignored and irrelevant. And perhaps because of the prominence of medical science, at least the way it's understood now in the West, there is an arrogance, as it is in the minds of most scientists and the scientific community, that theirs is the established norm. And, say, for medicine, everything else is an alternative, as in alternative medicine. And if we consider everything else as alternative, what is being said is that the medical science concentrating on humans only as biological beings, that takes the center stage. That we are biological beings with organic chemical sides to it and nothing more. And any other alternative is considered either irrelevant, and if the irrelevant is made relevant through efforts by the advocates of that other particular alternative, is then it's considered alternative medicine. So there is that monopoly in the mindset of most scientists, but especially of those in the medical science, that we are a body, a biological body. But then that calls into question as to whether we should still call it science, because science, strictly defined, talks about the observation and detection and understanding and the replicability of an experiment, that if it is repeated, it ought to always give the same result. To oversimplify it, that 2 + 2 is equal, no matter where you go and no matter when you measure it. That the environment, the time and space dimensions do not alter the results. 2 + 2 is always equal. And these have been called positive sciences. And so if biology or medical science is considered a science by that strict definition, we find the situation troubling, because for one, doctors often, because they consider us as a body, a biological body, organic matter, they treat every symptom with chemicals. And chemicals in their own natural way are perhaps more positivistic in terms of how they interact with one another. But when those chemicals are put in the human body, they do not replicate the same result over and over. And therefore, it becomes less scientific because of the element of predictability, or more accurately, unpredictability. So if you accept the fact that chemical interaction, as in medicine, when put into the human body, does not necessarily always give the same result. They might give similar results, but not necessarily always the same result. Therefore, you could say that medical science is not a science, because it fails the test of science itself, of absolute replicability. This ought to give us a clue to understand then that neither is medical science a science in the strictest sense of the definition, nor is the human body strictly biological. And so when you question both, then, as I said, the most respected of our sciences, medical science, is being questioned as to whether it knows who we are or not. We have ways of dealing with certain problems in our illnesses, quote unquote illnesses. I'm using the word illness in a very general term. Many of our not all of our illnesses are treated or can be treated by chemicals. We see the role of, say, acupuncture, that was, the view of this in the medical community was very dismissive of acupuncture 34 years ago. but it finds its way slowly. Pressure point treatment, yoga exercises, and there are many other ways that are used in therapy, in psychoanalysis, and so on and so forth, that all amount to the following: that we are not just a biological being. So what are we? The point is that every cell in our body is not a unit that is a component that is put one on top of another, or that are put together to create us. Let me rephrase that our body is made up of living cells, and every cell has a life of its own. So therefore, there is a life within the life that we claim ours. In other words, we are a totality of lives that come together in many harmonic convergences, in many harmonious ways, that aside from the fact that a particular cell has a life, it has a life that's functional in the context of the system of the body in which it has been designed and assigned to play the role. A particular protein, I don't want to get too scientific to bog you down with the idea, is that but a particular protein, a particular nutrient that goes into our body, how is it decided what role it should play in which of the many systems within our body? Whether it should become part of our lungs to help us in breathing, whether it should be part of, say, our stomach to become part of our digestive system, whether it should become part of our heart that pumps the blood and has a whole other system of its own, whether it should become a part of our fingertip that can help us use our sense of touch, whether it can become part of our retina in the eye so we can see with it. In essence, we might reduce every nutrient to its chemical makeup, to its organic nature. But that organic nature is not all it has. That once it enters our body, it in essence becomes a system within a system within a system. So, who are we? We are converged systems of harmony, of order, of functionality. We cannot reduce ourselves, even in the biological sense, only to our physical form. That if we simply accept the fact that inside of every single atom, that the interaction between the neutrons and protons and electrons, that movement is life, independent at one level and interconnected with many other levels. And therefore we go back to our first question. Who are we? Do we know ourselves? Now, before I continue further into confusing you on the topic, let's take a short break. We will come back, and in the next hour we will explore this further.